Let's do this thing. Hey, what's up, New Zealand and the world? Lucas Lawman's Kiwi voice. I tell you what, there has been some serious amount of content that I've got to choose from in order to put this stuff together. In light of what the mainstream media has been covering, and there has been a lot in the mainstream media and all the chatter across all of social media, as you would expect, a lot of hate, a lot of questions, but the predominant thing that seems to be coming through in response to the weekend's protests organised by the Freedom and Rights Coalition in Auckland, Wellington and Christchurch, that is the Million Man March, as they labelled it, is what are these people protesting about? We have got it really good here in New Zealand. Well, I'll tell you what, there's a lot more to it than that, and that's what's driven me to put this together. There is a stonk load of stuff to get through here, team. We're going to do our best to make it entertaining as well as informative and easy to watch. No more mucking around. Let's get into it. So why are Kiwis protesting? All across New Zealand, protests are continuing to occur against ideologically globalist-driven government action that is slowly but surely sending our country into a massive recession, both economically, sadly, socially also. The Freedom and Rights Coalition is the most active group in terms of large-scale protest, but we have advocacy group VFF, or Voices for Freedom, pretty well derided in the mainstream media, but they're doing great work. We have Unite, we have Freedom Alliance, all supporting each other at various times. More issues focused is Groundswell, representing the attack on farming and our food supply through complex and unnecessary regulation in the name of climate change. The Taxpayers Union, who have been at the forefront of opposition to Three Waters reforms, recently dropping 65,000 signatures plus signed submissions to the Parliament after government closed the ability to submit online. Up in the north of New Zealand, there are two groups protesting against the closure of New Zealand's only oil refinery in Marsden Point, way up in Northland there, Camp Sour and Diggin' at Marsden, where both of these groups have been on Kiwi Voice with detailed interviews. Scroll back through or hit the videos tab in Facebook or head to YouTube. They are all on there. It's worth catching up with what they're up to up there. There is, of course, now Nurses for Freedom. Also, we spoke with their leader, Debbie Cunliffe, recently, and they are doing fantastic work on behalf of all health staff, nurses, carers, OTs, etc., who have been mandated out of work. Those are the groups that we're looking at, and I'm sure there are many others that I've missed, and I apologise. But such is the state of social cohesion at the moment, there's just so many out there. I'm just giving those that aren't aware the example. So many Kiwis feel compelled to fight for something in their lives that they feel passionate about, and with so many issues touching so many people, there's plenty to choose from, and hence why there continues to be protests around the country. So what are the crises that we are facing as a country? What I'm going to do is I'm going to go through each crisis area, segment, and give you a summary at the end as to what specifically that protesters are protesting about. Now, I can't speak on behalf of all protesters, of course, but I'm giving a fairly good nudge from my understanding after attending all of the Freedom and Rights Coalition protests here in Christchurch, as well as others in the South Island, talking to Kiwis on the ground, and obviously spending my time researching, writing, and making videos for Kiwi Voice. So this is where we're at. Health crisis. Due to a combination of historical underinvestment, complete ineptitude by the current government to do anything other than centralise into Health NZ at the worst possible time, and a ridiculous vaccine mandate policy, our health system is in crisis. Although stated publicly by Health Minister Andrew Little that the government did have the mandate for healthcare under review over a week ago, nothing further has been announced. PM Jacinda Ardern also repeatedly refuses to add nurses to the fast-track immigration list, with nurses who are keen to come here needing to work for at least 2 years before being able to apply for residency. Now, if I get any of this stuff wrong, team, absolutely try and correct me down in the comments below. Keep the conversation open, civil and respectful. But why would you come here as a nurse or as a health professional at all and live in New Zealand right now. I mean, with some of the most expensive housing in the world offset against wages much, much lower than you can get just across the ditch in Australia, for example. There's talks of double pay over there for nurses in certain instances, and a 60-hour week ahead of you most likely most weeks here in New Zealand. You can understand why healthcare staff may not want to rush over to New Zealand, specifically in the nurses space. In summary, protesters are protesting against persisting vaccination mandates for healthcare workers, lack of action on our health system after having so much time to do so, including the immigration and pay issues mentioned above. If you don't know if you've been to any healthcare site in the last number of months, obviously with increasing COVID isolation policy, which we'll touch later on, as well as the shortage in staff from nurses, etc. as well, being exacerbated by this government policy, emergency wait room times are at their highest average that they have been in decades, 6 and 8 hours in some cases that I have been advised. Our fire service is in crisis. Now, this has garnered a lot of positive response on Kiwi Voices. We've covered this. You can head to any number of fire stations throughout New Zealand and see the same message plastered across their hangar doors or their entry signs outside. Equipment is failing, gear and training is not being kept up to standard. This is according to the unions within the fire service, and staffing levels are at critical levels, exacerbated by successive governments' underinvestment and inability or unwillingness to listen to the firefighters telling them exactly what's going on. It appears it's being completely ignored. They are underpaid, overworked, and being ignored. At multiple points over the last few months, there has been but one, that's right, one staff member on their dispatch call centre for the entire South Island. They, of course, were under a fairly persistent vaccine mandate as well, adding to the strain on staff resources. This has since been resolved, but the full extent at which staff not coming back to work in response to the way they were treated is yet to be known. In Northland, right up the top of New Zealand, multiple reports have been received of huge delays for fire units to attend any kind of fire emergency, and there not being enough staff to man the complex fire units, which have minimum amounts of firefighters required to operate, if those things are even working at the time. So in summary, protesting against the fire service's massive underinvestment and lack of support, as well as being completely ignored by the government. A critical service and worth protesting about. As I'm sure most of you out there would probably agree, when you need a fireman, you really just need a fireman. You don't need to know that the government has underfunded and understaffed and underprepared the people that are heading out to try and save your life. Housing crisis. New Zealand has, to quote the Bloomberg, one of the preeminent economic publications in the world, the bubbliest housing market in the world, on the entire planet, the bubbliest housing market. Our house prices are severely unaffordable, and coupled with now tightening finance conditions from all major banks as global inflationary issues take hold, this is pushing more and more people into renting long term, and for those that were leveraged highly at the peak, they are now being put under significant pressure, or further pressure, by rising interest rates to combat said inflation. The building supplies are also under huge inflationary pressure due to material shortages, shipping delays, supply chain issues, meaning the cost of building continues to increase massively. It is the number one contributor to our overall inflation rate, which is officially now at a 4-decade high, and we will cover this later in the video. I've watched young adult family members doing their absolute best to get onto the property ladder. They've saved an awesome deposit, they've done incredibly well, but it just seems to be getting harder and harder for them every day. Yes, they're missing out on properties, etc. When it comes to the price that they offer or the competition. That's normal, I guess. However, the lending rules continue to change, the pre-approval windows get shorter, the banks are being so much more cautionary. It's really, really hard out there for people. especially in that first home buyer bracket. Summary. Protesting against further government ineptitude, Labour campaigned on tackling the housing crisis, among other things they haven't even got close to achieving with Kiwi Build. That fast became the joke of the nation. I'm sure you'll all remember that, with less than 1/10 of the houses being built that they had promised. We now have full motels everywhere as a substitute for emergency housing. It's really, really sad. So protesting against housing policy and inaction on housing policy. Moving on over to something that Kiwi Voice has covered in a lot of detail, and there's been protests from multiple groups all over the country in regards to this. It is one of the most divisive reform policy issues that has been dealt with in New Zealand in decades, as much as I can remember in my lifetime. That's right, Three Waters. So, where do I start with this one? Three Waters reforms are one of the most controversial public infrastructure policies in decades, as I said. We would all universally agree, I would think, I'm making a lot of assumptions here, that our water and the management of it is key to our very way of life. Water is life. It's true. I don't think many would argue with that. As a result, there's some really strong opinion out there on this, both for and against on Three Waters, but from my time on the ground speaking to Kiwis, councillors, mayors, it's mostly against. Like, I'm talking 90% against. It's incredibly unpopular, yet the current Labour government continues to defy the public voice and push forward regardless. Now I'm talking the public voice straight up, social media, protesting, submissions, you name it. The voice is out there. But also, of course, what we've seen at these road shows, what we are hearing through councils who are advocating on behalf of their local constituents, government's completely ignoring all of it and pushing forward regardless. Three Waters explaining all of this could absolutely be a video all of its own, but I'm going to give it my best shot to summarise. Currently, New Zealand's Three Waters, which is wastewater, stormwater and drinking water, are managed locally by 78 different councils. That's 61 district and city councils, 11 regional councils and 6 unitary councils. They own the assets. They are responsible for the upkeep, investment and daily management, including any debt they incur on said assets. Some are doing a fantastic job of this and have been for some time. Some councils are definitely not and need to change what they do, perhaps with some government in assistance. The majority, however, of these entities are doing a fine job. The reforms propose to take all of these local management setups and centralise them into 4 large entities to cover all of New Zealand. This moves daily management away from your local council and into the hands of unelected bureaucrats, sitting in an office somewhere hundreds of kilometres away, in some cases in a different town or city, with no ability to vote these people out regardless of the job that they do. This takes away ownership of the assets at a local level, regardless of the fact that government has advised that it would take on any debt also as part of the reforms. The other controversial aspect of these reforms is the co-governance aspect. It's contentious, and I won't go into a lot of detail around this for and against, but essentially they would have the management board of these 4 entities, these 4 water entities, made up of 50% Māori, who currently represent approximately 17% of New Zealand's total population at the last check. Again, these people are not democratically voted in, they are appointed by the boards. Opponents say this is using race as a political tool. Proponents say it's about time this kind of thing happened. Although the supporting voice at this stage is very, very small. There has been a fairly strong censorial effort around these reforms also, you'd be not surprised to hear, with LGNZ, or Local Government New Zealand, which is the body that's supposed to be representing all councils across the country. They're taking money from the government in return for signing a memorandum of understanding that they would not speak poorly of the reforms in the media or to their members. This, to me, is completely and utterly unbelievable. Summary. As I said, we could talk all day about Three Waters reforms, but essentially here, people are protesting against a centralisation or what is seen as theft of public assets and an attack on democracy by way of removing your ability to participate in said democracy when it comes to your water and the racial division element of said policy. Unworkable agricultural regulations including SNAs. Now, Groundswell NZ is the most well-known agricultural protest group in New Zealand, although there are definitely others. They have participated in a number of protests different around New Zealand, with their most well-known event being the mother of all protests, where farmers from across the country drove their tractors into the middle of towns and cities throughout New Zealand, causing gridlock. We watched footage of what has been happening with farmers in the Netherlands, as well as the collapse of Sri Lanka, in horror, when in reality there are a number of policies and political movements happening here in the agriculture sector in New Zealand based around the climate change agenda that have been putting pressure on farmers in New Zealand and around the world for years. Just as farmers in Holland have been protesting since 2019 over these issues, so have Groundswell been for some time. Sri Lanka was years in the making as well, around from about 2018 through to the current collapse. I make this point as Groundswell and a growing group of Kiwis can see the future here looking like what is happening in multiple other countries when it comes to food and food supply. Food shortages being experienced around the world, and the subsequent massive inflation on the remaining food is feared to arrive in New Zealand. We can see it happening. We have already have some shortages in some products persisting, and prices for basics are continuing their upward trend. Groundswell states on their website they oppose the following: National Policy Statement on Fresh Water, that's NPS-FW, Significant Natural Areas, that's SNAs, the National Policy Statement on Indigenous Biodiversity, NPS-IB, Emissions Trading Scheme, or ETS, and Climate Change Policies, Agricultural Emissions Tax, Three Waters Reforms, Water Services Bill, Crown Pastoral Land Reform Bill, and Clean Car Package. Now, we're not going to go into all of those. We'll be here all evening. The key ones I have picked out, though: Significant Natural Areas, or SNAs. The requirements within this are counterproductive to positive environmental outcomes, says Groundswell's website, disrespect private property rights, and pit councils against their most conservation-minded landowners. This box-ticking policy needs to be withdrawn and replaced with strategies and actions based on threats to Indigenous biodiversity, particularly weeds and pests. The other one we're looking at here is the Emissions Trading Scheme, or ETS, and Climate Change Policies. These are incentivising large areas of farmland into pines, Groundswell say, having detrimental impacts on rural communities. They are a significant cost burden on the world's most emissions-efficient farmers. The unworkable elements of climate change policy and the ETS are delivering perverse outcomes and must be fixed. Summary: while Groundswell and others continue to work on their own protest action at various sites and times around the country, protesters at the mass marches we've been seeing see the effect these unworkable regulations are having and what future they bring to us. They are protesting against the attack in our agriculture sector through these reforms. What else are we protesting? There's more to come. Ongoing COVID policy. Currently, we still have vaccine mandates in place for the health sector, as stated previously, but the persistence in the mainstream media and propaganda directly delivered by the government around COVID-19 messaging is truly starting to wear society down. The growing majority of Kiwis can see that none of these measures are working, or have worked even, in the past, and are growing increasingly fatigued by it all. With schools now being asked to strongly encourage mask wearing in our 4 years and up children for this term, mask mandates still technically in place for retail and council facilities among dwindling public compliance and isolation rules across New Zealand, causing havoc with staff shortages and overall loss of productivity. Kiwis have had enough. Summary: protesting against continued damaging and useless COVID measures and reporting. They are asking to move to living with COVID-19 as almost every single other country bar China currently is. There is so much more going on that is damaging our beautiful country and our close-knit society in the small population of 5 million people. You know, I always reference the small population. You look at Japan as the direct comparison that I would give. Similar landmass, similar land size, 150 million people. We've got 5 million people rattling around in little old New Zealand. It's more of a community base, as it should be. We could list rising crime, the insipid proliferation of woke culture into our institutions, the inaction on our mental health crisis, being left to great Kiwis like Mike King with his I Am Hope organisation, the banning of new oil and gas exploration, and the closure of our only refinery, the overwhelming green gender push that is underpinning a lot of the above and forcing power prices upwards. But due to its overarching nature and feeding into or from the above problems, I have chose to finish on inflation and the cost of living crisis. I've left the gruntiest one till last here, team. We just recently hit our highest inflation figure in more than 32 years at an annual rate of 7.3%. Although there is some dispute that this is the true figure, both directions up and down by some commentators, namely Damien Grant from the TPU. He explains essentially that quarter to quarter inflation is not what it seems. It's worth going to have a read. He was printed in Stuff not that long ago. This means that groceries are higher. Petrol is close to $3 a litre everywhere. Although this has seen drops in the past week, I do admit, rents and mortgage costs have increased to historic levels, and just flat out, everything is dearer. Pints at the pub are $2 or $3 more on an anecdotal bit of evidence there. I've noticed the last couple of times I've gone. All of this is, of course, directly affecting our most financially vulnerable populations and increasing poverty everywhere you look. Sure, this has been contributed to by perhaps decades of poor monetary policy. I will concede that, but aggressively accelerated by this government's persistently frivolous spending over the last 3 or 4 years. We did a separate live on this a month or two back regards the frivolous spending. The COVID Relief Fund on March 25th, 2020, hours before going into level 4 lockdown, Parliament passed the Impress Supply 3rd 2019-2020 Act, allowing it to increase the level of money it spent and got into debt for to $52 billion. $12.1 billion of spending was already set aside and announced for its economic response package, including tax changes and the first chunk of what would become the wage subsidy. This possible $52 billion was on top of that. Grant Robertson said at the time, the scale of the spending is the price we have to pay. While reading the bill, he also stated, it is the price of making sure our public health system can operate and support New Zealanders. It is the price of people keeping their jobs and keeping their homes. It is the price of cushioning the blow to businesses and of keeping them afloat. And it is the price of making sure that the core of our economy exists, that we can build on to recover in the way that New Zealanders want us to do. There were a few rules tied to the spending other than the following: a maximum $40 billion spent on expenses, $10 billion on capital investment, and $2 billion on capital injections. So how did that actually go? Did we save all the businesses we wanted to? Did the New Zealand taxpayer get the value back for their dollar in supporting their fellow Kiwi business owners? Considering in the past 6 months we have heard that more businesses have closed than opened in the previous 12, for the first time in decades, you'd have to say that the wage subsidy kind of failed, other than to provide some temporary wage relief for workers and remove some stress from businesses before a lot of them shut anyway. Their total spent on the wage subsidy is now well over $15 billion. We have heard stories of $34 million being spent on advertising, consultants, lawyers and hotels to support Three Waters, a majority opposed water reform in the end. Reported on by Chris Lynch and us, through Christchurch City Councillor Sam McDonald. We all balked at the $2 million funding to a mongrel mob-led meth rehabilitation program, $51 million on setting up the new Crown entity for regulating drinking water, a $900 million loan to Air New Zealand, a bailout essentially, $118 million to Crown Research Institute's COVID-19 response and recovery, whatever that is. I even saw increase to doubtful debts provision due to COVID-19 at $32 million under the education section. So that was an interesting one, whether they are putting money aside to cover for doubtful debts as part of their budget. I'm not sure exactly what that is. There was also providing digital identity required for online assessment and learning, also under the education section, of $24 million. Now, this was all under the COVID-19 recovery fund, and I'm just picking out some highlights. Now, sure, there is some great stuff in there, absolutely positive stuff and well-deserving areas that I'm sure a lot of us would agree is socially a good thing to do. We're over 250 programs, causes, areas that had money allocated to them, including $400 million to the tourism sector as a recovery fund, and $57 million to expand the Warmer Kiwi Homes program for low-income households. Those are all things that a lot of us, I'm sure, would get on board with. And don't forget, $52 million, though, to the racing industry as a recovery package, another bailout for the racing industry, and our favourite, $42 million to the Public Interest Journalism Fund after $55 million in the first round. So what is the result of all of this? Well, New Zealand's debt is at historically high levels. The last time government spending peaked far higher than what we'd seen in recent history was post-GFC in 2008 and the Canterbury earthquakes in 2011 as 34.6% of GDP. With this spending, we're looking at 38.59% of GDP. They predict this to come down to normal levels by 2024. However, with such great need elsewhere throughout society and the economy, I don't see how this is possible. We are now in a position where the only way out of inflation is to rise interest rates. We know this from history, to levels above the current true inflation rate. And we are some ways off that, of course. Current mortgage interest rates, for example, are somewhere between 5 and 6%. Current inflation running at 7.3, some say could be higher. Interest rates are going to have to be significantly above that to put downward pressure on inflation. Essentially, a lot more pain needs to be felt throughout New Zealand before we see any end to this economic destruction. Inflation is the centre point of all of it. Summary. People are protesting against monetary policy that is driving inflation to unmanageable levels. All of this boils down to one unrefutable point throughout all of these marches. This Labour government must go. All of those issues that we've discussed this evening, all wrapped up into one ball of discontent with the New Zealand public that comes down to simply political movement, political will. These people are saying this Labour government must go. We're just making sure that the word is out there, that voices are being heard for the next election. People are being made aware. That is where we sit. Thanks everyone for tuning in. I appreciate if you've made it to this point. She's been a long, detailed one, but it is important, I believe, to get it out there as to why there is persistent protesting and civil unrest across the country. Thanks for taking the time to tune in and listen to the detail. Get in amongst the comments down below. Share these links around YouTube and Facebook. If you're on YouTube, hit that subscribe button if you have not already yet. Thanks to everyone and all the followers who continue to contribute to us through the stars system and the comments and likes and shares. But for now, team, stay safe, stay free, and we'll see you again real soon. Whew. Goodie.